day, if I trust my leader, all of the other stuff gets easier, right? It's the lack of trust that impacts accountability, that impacts transparency, that impacts a lot of those other components. And so if I have trust, then when you're working towards something and you can't tell me, I trust that you're still doing it from the right place. I trust that you're still doing it with the right intention. And when you don't have that, then you're like questioning, right? You're constantly questioning. And so it is that balance, I think, of building that trust, but then finding the pathways to how do we build it faster?
Hey, Loren, are you ready for another episode of Campus Confidential?
Yes. This was a great episode.
It was a great episode. There's so many things that I want to talk about, but let's tell the people who our guests were first.
That's a great idea. Let me find my sheet of paper that I usually look at. Okay, we have two fantastic guests with us today, Kelsey and listeners. Dr. Julie Leos is a search consultant for Spelman Johnson. She's been with the firm for about a year, and many listeners probably know Spelman Johnson. They specialize in higher education search and placement. She previously served at the University of South Florida as the assistant dean for residential education. She was there about 8 years. And then before that, University of Michigan, University of Arizona, and Florida State University. The other guest is Molly Kurth, who is the Senior Vice President for HR, Learning, and Talent Development for Compass Group North America. She has 30 years in the hospitality industry, leading operations, human resources, sales, marketing, communications. She's a certified life and leadership coach. You can tell in this episode, I think, the founder of Molly Kurth Coaching. And I think notably, because of our topic in higher education, she's chair of the Ohio State University Hospitality Management Advisory Board. So really great insights today and great guests.
Yeah, they're great. I appreciate Molly. She had 3 folks that were attached to University of Michigan in some way, shape, or form, and she didn't once bring up the Ohio State.
Yeah. Did I bring up Ohio State? I hope I didn't. She was too kind. I might have.
No, you didn't. We were very, it was all very,
well, we're friendly,
very friendly, which I appreciate. So what was something that stuck out to you in this conversation?
Well, to me, this is among the most quotable episodes. There were so many things that registered with me. So for example, let's see, make space for practice. I loved that comment. And really what I was thinking about was how much we've talked about the skills that are needed and the attributes we admire, but how little we've talked about how just like, it's NCAA season here. You have to practice at the things you want to get good at. And so I really, really loved that comment. And the other thing I'll say is there was a comment about higher education. We talk about wanting great leadership and culture and behaviors, and then we hire for skills because we're afraid to actually look for things that are harder to measure. And so I thought that was a really great comment too. How about you? What stuck with you?
That one stuck with me. And I wrote down, what are we really ready for? And I think that's, I think one of them said that exactly. I think Julie might've said that is, what are we actually ready for? Because it's one thing to talk about it, exactly like you said, but it's another thing to do it. And so hopefully in a lot of these conversations, we're giving folks tools to actually make the changes that they want. The other piece was trust at scale is culture. So y'all saw that as the title of this episode. And I really think that's been sitting with me ever since we had the conversation.
Completely true. And there was a comment too, that if I trust my leader, all the other stuff gets easier. So how important that is.
That's right. Maybe we need a whole series on trust. I don't know. But for now, let's listen in on what Molly and Julie had to share. Here we are for another episode of Campus Confidential. How are you doing today, Loren?
Doing fantastic. It's snowing out, but I'm warm inside. How are you?
Snowing but warm inside. I like it. I'm doing all right. It's a Monday. We don't usually record on Mondays, so I feel a little discombobulated on timing, but super excited for the conversation.
Me too.
Julie, how are you today?
I can't really complain. I'm in Central Texas. It did get kind of cool today, but there's no snow, to Loren's point, and I am also warm inside. I do.
I love this. Warm inside. Excellent. Molly, how are you today?
I'm doing great. It's a sunny Monday here in Charlotte, which, despite what everybody told me about moving down here, it does rain and be cloudy a lot more than I expected. So it's nice to see the sun out.
Oh, I think people like to make up good weather when they're trying to get people to move to places in the country. We moved to Charlottesville, Virginia, and people were like, it never snows. And then in February, when we moved, it snowed 13 inches. I was like, what do you mean it never snows? I don't understand what's going on.
Right.
But
it's not right.
Oh, God.
Liars.
Tricked you.
Yeah, maybe that. I don't know if that's a
Speaking
tactic
of talent
in
acquisition
attracting.
and talent recruitment.
Exactly. This is right on target.
This is totally on topic. So on that note, just a reminder to our listeners, we are in the middle of our mini series around employee satisfaction in higher education. And today's topic is attracting and retaining talent. And we have two experts, Molly and Julie, as you heard in the intro, joining us. And so what I think is really interesting is we spend a lot of time in higher education, at least I have, and Loren, I know you and I've had this conversation that we talk a lot about students, attracting and retaining students. And there's a lot of effort put into that. But I think we're at a time and place that attracting and retaining talent, those employees that are going to serve the students, is even more important than it ever has been before. So why don't you give us a little bit of, is there a stat or something from our study that we did with E15, Akuhai, NERSA, and SCUP that maybe sets up this conversation?
Right. Yeah. I want to offer a few things that might also help our guests today, Molly and Julie, dig a little deeper into what we're sharing. But you mentioned Compass Group, Akuhai, NERSA did the survey in July of 23, so it's pretty current. We had 431 respondents. And maybe the big headlines are reported this way. Career satisfaction, according to the survey data, is down 27% compared to just 5 years ago. A quarter of respondents are actively seeking new jobs. And 75% of them, by the way, have been in higher education for at least 10 years. So this is not a new employee kind of situation. The top reasons for job search were reported as higher pay and more growth opportunity. But that's an asterisk because I don't know that those might be the presenting kinds of things, but there may be something deeper going on. The good news is, though, of those seeking new jobs, 80% are seeking new jobs within higher education. So silver lining, folks aren't trying to get out per se, but they might be trying to get out of the situation they're in. 86% say that positive working relationships with colleagues is a top attribute of their work environment. Good news. We might dig into that a bit. 75% feel supported by their direct manager, but only 43% feel support from campus leadership. Okay, so there's something notable to think about. So, I think there's a lot here to think about, and we can certainly go back to those data, but Julie and Molly have lots of experience, I think, to help us unpack some of this. And I guess the first thing I want to ask of each of you, maybe we'll start with you, Julie, is does any of this surprise you, given your role helping institutions find great talent or great talent find great opportunities? Do those data surprise you at all, or what are you observing? And then Molly, we'll go to you, and I know, looking at the workforce across higher education in a broader way, does anything surprise you? So Julie, could you start a little bit about what you're observing, and anything I shared surprise you?
Sure. I think sometimes the numbers always surprise me because I feel like, wow, 43, that's half, but in many ways it doesn't, right? When we are doing searches, we always spend time with the campus, the people in the department, right? And so we meet with them, we talk to them about what they need in leaders, about what they're experiencing to kind of understand the culture. And all of this tracks. And what's interesting about it is in some different places, it might be more so or less so depending on, the loyalty they have to leadership or what's happening in the department or like what's going on specifically around finances and decisions and things like that. But for the most part, I think that folks are feeling a little bit maybe underappreciated and a little bit overworked, right? And I think that is something that lends to that. I think, like you mentioned, like compensation is one thing that always comes up, but it never ends up being the thing that people might say it in a survey, but it's not the actual thing that leads them to do it. I think it might be the reason why people stay just a little bit longer, but if the underlying things are still there, they may still decide to leave later. I think it's a little bit of everything, right? That's kind of piled up that people can't actually really point to the reason why they're dissatisfied in the workplace, but many are. And so I think that this conversation will help dig into a few of those things as we move along.
Yeah, we might be getting symptoms rather than causal kinds of things that are driving people. Right. Molly, what about you? What are you observing as you look at the workforce for higher education? And does anything here surprise you?
Yeah, I don't think anything really surprises me. I think what you're seeing in your data is mirrored in a lot of data that's happening in our environment, in our industry, as you think about the higher education space and the changing landscape, right? You're looking at enrollments and people asking questions about where do I want my career to go? The idea of skills-based hiring and competencies, I think, is also changing how people are looking at their career opportunities. So if you look generationally at the workforce, they're starting to say, maybe I don't have to work in this very linear north-south movement. I can be east-west. So maybe I could look in the higher education space and I could go, all right, I'm working in auxiliary services now, and maybe recreation services is interesting to me, or maybe facilities is interesting to me, or maybe there's a different kind of campus environment that I want to check out. I love the space, but let me explore. And so I think you see a lot more exploratory willingness and openness in the space. But I think as you look at some of those data points, I think it points more to your point, they don't want to leave the industry. They're not looking to leave higher education, but maybe just wanting to see, where else can I excel? Where else can I grow? And that idea that I want to continue to learn and develop, give me the space to do that.
Are you suggesting that maybe the movement is not only exhaustion and burnout, but rather job growth and opportunity?
I do. I think that there's a little bit of that. And I think as we think about hybrid workforce and all of that, understanding what that can look like and how that can show up for people and understanding how we can create those spaces. There's a lot of ways to deal with burnout and frustration. And sometimes that east-west movement or those different opportunities can help people move away and navigate differently through that.
It's interesting. The burnout and frustration piece continues to come up, and you say there's a lot of ways to address it. So is there a couple of things that are on your mind when you think about how to address burnout and then employee satisfaction and retention together? Is there something that sticks with you or comes up?
I think a lot of it right now is looking at, what are we asking of people, right? And how do we redefine jobs? How do we think about your role and your responsibilities? And are you doing the things that we need you to be doing in those roles? And, we talk a lot about simplification and making jobs easier and how do we help people drive that? But I think one of the things that we find in there is simplification isn't just taking the 100 things you do today and making them simpler, right? It's about looking at the 100 things you do today. How can I turn it into 50? And how can I make those 50 things simpler or more efficient? Sometimes we're complex organizations, complex institutions. Everything isn't always easy. But how do we help people connect back to the value of what they're doing? I think a lot of times burnout comes from, I'm in this space of, this is necessary and required. I may be good enough at it, but I don't love it, right? But I'm not so frustrated by it that I have to go find something else. So I just keep doing it. And then I realize, this is exhausting. I'm not filling myself up. I'm not getting that recharge and that refresh from what I do. And so can we do that? Can we find that space where somebody finds a little bit more of their joy, a little bit more of what fills up their cup in what they do, knowing it can't be everything every day. But how do we help people find that, I think, is one of the ways that you can help start to address that.
That's right. And Julie, as you're talking with people posting positions, right? So people are coming to you with roles. Are they reconsidering any of the pieces that Molly's laying out, reconsidering how the job is structured, function? What kind of conversations are you having with people when they're thinking about attracting new talent?
Or are you counseling them to change things? That'd be interesting too.
I am. We are.
Yes and yes and yes.
And it's really hard, right? I think that, I've had this conversation a lot in the past few months about like that everything, all the problems we have in higher ed specifically around this are all leadership problems, right? So it's when you think about, she was saying about really unrealistic expectations, right? That and it's coming from all levels of the institution. And so if you don't have a leader, for example, that can block some of that or can really speak truth to power around the things that you can't add to people's plate at this time, it gets really hard, right? Because that trust gets lost. But what I'm trying to explain to people, if they can't rearrange the job, for example, what are some of the barriers that you can manage before somebody would arrive on campus, right? And so if you have a really difficult, if you have really difficult HR problems, don't let that be the first thing that somebody comes in to do. Manage that, manage that before they get there, right? If there's a really hard decision that needs to happen, you could let that person come in and make that decision, but maybe it's something you want to do ahead of time. So they're not the face of something that's really terrible. And I think that for many years, we've just done that, right? A new person in the role has been the solution to the problem, but they're just going to step into the problem. And so, that's the kinds of things that we talk with hiring authorities all the time about is like, okay, this seems to be a problem. Can we manage it before this person comes? How do you want to talk about this? So that because, at Spelman Johnson and most firms really like how we want to be honest about the problems that they're going to step into, the challenges, and really the opportunities that they're going to have to thrive there. Like all of those things exist together because we find that there's somebody for every problem and for every opportunity. Some people want that. But you don't want to make it harder than you need to make it. So yes, we're having those conversations. I think that we want to eliminate the factors that are going to stop them from staying a while, and then also provide solutions for things that could help them stay longer, right? How do you explain to them how work is done in your organization? How do you explain to them what the culture is, what the values are, so that they can see, like, can they see themselves? I had some conversations with colleagues about belonging, not just for students, but also for staff, right? They have to see themselves there in order for them to be able to contribute to it. And so I think everything's tied to a string, which is a good thing, right? Because you can fix one thing and kind of help the next.
It's interesting about your comment about kind of taking care of things before folks arrive on campus. I'm kind of back to the E15 survey research, but there were two issues: the negative environment attributes, the attributes about the environment that are most negative for employees and sometimes motivate leaving. They say is number one, non-transparent communication, and the second was accountability or lack of accountability. And so I'm wondering too, because we heard this other stat that my direct supervisor supports me, but I don't have a relationship or trust in campus leadership. Is this accountability question that's come up here in your minds, where does that sit? Do you find that when you're counseling or coaching folks that they feel a lack of agency to make the decisions you're counseling them to make before an employee comes? Do you find that it's somewhere else at the institution? And what explains that gap? I trust my direct supervisor, but not the campus leadership.
It's interesting. When you think about leaders and you think about the higher education space and think about how often leaders are changing now, right? And so when we all got into the space, sometimes university presidents were there for 10, 12, 15 years. Now, sometimes they're there for 2 or 3. And so sometimes that transparency is hard to get to because there is a lot of change happening and people look for stability, right? So not only do they want to care, but they want to know that they can trust the stability that's coming. And so I think it's really figuring out how can we create that and build that and look at that as a competency that is key to driving the leadership strategy. Because at the end of the day, if I trust my leader, all of the other stuff gets easier, right? It's the lack of trust that impacts accountability, that impacts transparency, that impacts a lot of those other components. And so if I have trust, then when you're working towards something, like Julie said, and you can't tell me, I trust that you're still doing it from the right place. I trust that you're still doing it with the right intention. And when you don't have that, then you're like questioning, right? You're constantly questioning. And so it is that balance, I think, of building that trust, but then finding the pathways to how do we build it faster? Because it can't take us 3 years or 4 years to build trust. And it's also not going to happen in 3 minutes. So what is that balance? Where do we focus and how do we build those relationships so that people can have a foundation of it?
So, Molly, do you think we're currently obsessed on this podcast with individual at scale, because I feel like everything that keeps coming up feels very individual. We build trust at an individual level with each of our team members, with the people around us, whatever that looks like. But then I think what you're talking about is scale, because at some point we're talking major organizations. The group you're working with, Compass Group, is like a multi-university, multi-department, all of these different pieces. And then universities are very complex. And so trust is coming in a variety of different ways. So do you have any processes or systems that you're thinking about to impact that change?
You know, we say a lot in our business that we want to build an enterprise framework that allows for business solutions, right? And so we're a very decentralized organization, and we want to allow for people to have something to anchor to that still is built on their brand, their experience, their environment. And I think that when we think about how do we build that with leaders, it comes back to this idea that focusing more on skills-based hiring, focusing more on what are the competencies you need to be a really effective leader, are some of those foundational things that help somebody. So if I look at your resume and you've got 20 years experience in this space, and I'm like, okay, great, that makes you most qualified. The reality is that talent's just shifting around the table, right? We're just moving puzzle pieces and we're moving people around. But if we're really willing to say, I need you to be somebody who instills trust. I need you to be somebody who builds effective teams, somebody who is willing to have nimble learning and be resourceful. Those are competencies and skills that then create that trust organizationally and create a culture. Because really what we're talking about is culture, right? So trust at scale is culture. And so when you think about trust in individuals and teams, when you really do it effectively, it becomes your culture.
Well, and I find too that, so I went to visit a placement recently, and he said to me, he was like, you know what? I'm so glad that I'm here. He said, because even my wife tells me that I'm better at home because I'm in this organization. And so I was trying to think about, like, what is it about this place that has transformed him, like on a personal level and in a, at work. And, we work a lot with this organization, and they are, it's a kind of a family business, if you were to think about it in that way, in that, like, they can sit around the table and, like, really talk about issues and, some of the problems that are organizationally kind of tie them together. And I think that is, that's when I talk to hiring authorities all the time, they're like, we need somebody who can build trust. Like, to your point, Molly, we need somebody who can build trust, who can build relationships. And, and that's at the core of what they really need for the people who are there. But then you fast forward to an interview, for example, and if they have not worked in dining, or if they have not worked in housing, or if they have not been at the front end of crisis, if they have not, then they sometimes can't get through the door, right? And so my job is to say, like, look at this person, they can build the kind of culture that you want. Can you teach them what they need to know? And I don't think that as higher education, some places are there, but I think the core of the issue is that we're not there yet. That we would allow for people, we're talking about, like, the switching and going to this and trying out facilities. And it's not a safe place to try things out still, because there's so much work to do that nobody's willing to take the risk, unfortunately. And that's what I'm seeing across the board. Very few people, at least.
And you likely know that old saying, I think it's Peter Drucker, somebody, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So your point about culture, well taken. What I'm wondering is, what do leaders, supervisors need to know about and do to onboard employees into culture? If culture is this powerful, which I believe it is too, powerful indicator of success and understanding for an employee, what needs to happen to help employees get that sooner and feel that sooner and understand it sooner?
It's a big question.
Yeah.
We got nothing but time. Can you wait?
I think it starts with the idea of somebody's success isn't just driven on technical knowledge. And so oftentimes when we onboard somebody and we bring them into the organization, it's, you got to fill out all your paperwork. You got to do all the technical things. You got to demonstrate technical knowledge. We've got to teach you whether it's food safety or university policies or physical safety. We've got to do all these things, which are critically important, right? They're the things that make sure that we can run as a well-oiled machine in whatever we're doing. But through all of that, we haven't created connection to the organization. We haven't created connection to the person's experience. And so understanding what does that look like to create connection. And it may look very different for somebody who is working in a very technical field. If you're working in HVAC and you're working in facilities management, what connection looks like to you might be different than what connection looks like to you working in residence life or housing. But there's still connection points, and it's knowing who can I go to, right? If I come into an organization and I don't know who I can ask a question of, I may never ask the question because I may not feel safe. But if somebody says, hey, Molly, Loren's going to be your peer mentor and you come into this role, if you have any questions, Loren's going to be your go-to. You can ask him anything and no judgment. He's going to help you navigate through it. Now all of a sudden I'm like, oh, okay, I've got somebody. I've got this person. So it's thinking through what are those connection points and how are we really creating somebody feeling like they know that they belong here and that they know they have a space here, not just I'm filling a box, I'm checking off your list, I'm filling out your schedule, but I am actually somebody who matters and somebody who has value.
Yeah, I would argue onboarding is done generally very poorly. And when it's done and called that, it's most often insurance forms and retirement forms and all of those things. And one of the things I had started to do in the latter part of my career and do now is I usually identify, you can figure out who, I call as the culture keeper, the person who kind of knows the way the place works and the stuff that's not written down, and who understands sort of the cadence and rhythm of when you raise things to somebody and when you don't. And, I remember it, at Michigan, their board week of Regents Week, very busy for folks. That is not the week to bring things up, but it's not written anywhere, right? And then there's, the culture keeper also is intuitive about, just sort of what values exist in the place. So, I feel like onboarding is done to culture is done poorly, while onboarding to systems is generally done pretty well. And I don't know if that's been your experience or only mine in the places I've worked, but that seems to be something that you're kind of getting at with culture, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity in onboarding and creating that right experience, right? And even our systems, onboarding, when they define it, is truly just that. It's the paperwork, it's the processing, it's the getting you hired, getting you set up with your time card or, your benefits or whatever those things are. And the reality is that's just process orientation, right? And so we always say if everything you're doing is just to check a list, you've completely missed the opportunity to connect to culture. And so how do we rethink how we're doing that? And I think it starts with, to your point, Loren, who are those culture keepers? How do we help? If I go into a campus and manage a dining program and I've got somebody who's worked there for 20 years, I promise you they know every student who comes in there, they know their favorite order, they know all of the things. They also know that hey, there's this big event happening on campus that we should all be aware of and we should be connecting to, or they know, something bad happened, right? They're the ones who are helping create those connections for students. And when they're able to feel empowered to do that, then they create an environment that people want to be part of. Because everybody wants to be included, right? Everybody wants to feel part of something, no matter what your role is and no matter where you work.
Back to Julie's point about belonging, maybe a bit earlier.
I think the conversation, the only thing I'll add about onboarding is this: do it.
I like your brevity.
I mean,
yes, and do it.
I'm serious. Like, how many times have people, like, their first 2 weeks on a job just been in their office taking the golf cart course? I'm serious. That's the kind of thing. And I like to add another point to this. I don't know if we could talk about this here, but I saw this like Facebook post, I guess, that had, or LinkedIn, something about a recent NASPA experience that someone had. It was an observation that I think ties well here about, administrators, vice presidents, directors, like people like high up in the field, kind of not taking the time to mentor the new folks that had come to a conference. And I feel like that's just so opposite of, maybe that's just one person's experience, but I thought about it a lot because I feel like my entry into student affairs and higher education, so many people poured into me that I had to be the one to say, like, okay, Julie, like, it's time to turn it around, right? Like, you have to now start doing that for other folks. And back on a campus, I think it's very similar, is that some of our directors or AVPs or they're pulled in so many directions that our most precious thing to pass on culture is our time with other people, spending time with them, having really good supervision in terms of like sitting down, talking to them about the things that they need to know. They're going to pick it up, right? It's just like if you throw students into residence halls, they're going to build a cult, like their culture is going to be built, community is going to be built. You just have to figure, it may not be what you want, right? We get a chance to shape it. It's the same thing with supervision and onboarding folks, is that, I think our people are moved in so many directions that they don't even have time to pour into the new folks that are there. And so I just kind of feel like that priority needs to come back into focus, because without it, we'll continue having this conversation for years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good point.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think it speaks to kind of what we were talking about a little bit earlier, is like you did some things to get through the pandemic and it became very task oriented, emergency type work. And some people and some of us as a culture haven't been able to unwind that. Like, where is the priority of time and energy being spent now? And I think that's where the employee is saying, hey, it's on me. It's on us, because we're the ones that are going to make the impact. And what I think is really interesting too is a lot of what we're talking about are these middle managers. I make an argument that pretty much everyone in the world is a middle manager, because we're all reporting to somebody and somebody's reporting to us, right?
I had a friend who used to say, everybody got a boss. Even the president got a boss.
Right? There's a board. So, some of it is, in thinking about it, and would love your all's opinion, is there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the individual level too, because I think when you're asking people, what is it that you want to be spending your time on? How do you want to be spending your time? What matters to you? I don't know that people are even taking the space to be able to answer that question.
I think it's so true. I was reading some research on some companies that tell employees to target 10% of their time for development. So imagine you work a 40-hour week. Let's just pretend we all work just a 40-hour week, 4 hours a week. Can you imagine spending 4 hours a week on development? And that could be, to your point, Julie, that could be a mentoring conversation. That could be coffee with someone who is interested. It could be reading an article, taking a class, working on a stretch assignment. I would speculate that for most people, they don't spend 4 hours a month doing it. And so to your point, Kelsey, it's how do we help people create space? But that comes back to culture, because if I'm rewarded and recognized for constantly going and constantly producing and constantly being busy, and we, talk about our calendars and they're packed and I have no space for myself, I don't know how to do it, because nobody's teaching me and nobody's modeling it and nobody's showing me. And so some of this is, how do we step back as leaders and say, how do you do it? And, I talk a lot with my team. So I do a minimum of 6 mentoring conversations a month. And for me, in the role I'm in and where I sit, that's critically important to me. Not everybody has to do that many or that level, but that's It's 3 hours of my time. It's usually 30-minute conversations, right? But even just making the time and prioritizing that sends a different message to my team about how then they can then prioritize their time. So when they say, hey, I'm going to go participate in this webinar on Tuesday at 2:00, they don't feel bad about it. They don't feel like they've got to justify it. They just go do it. And so some of it is, how are we modeling the behavior that we want people to feel comfortable doing? And if you haven't had a leader who models it for you, it's really hard sometimes to step into that. It's really hard to step into, I'm going to go do this thing when I have a leader who doesn't get it, maybe doesn't encourage it, or doesn't value it. So it's how do you start to do that? Where do you find the people, right? Where do you find your people in the organization, in the environment, in the industry that can help you do that?
Yeah. Well, and that's the culture. If people are leaving and everybody's burned out and don't feel like they have agency or the skills, that's your culture. If you are spending time with people, nurturing talent, asking about family and what they need to be successful, there's your culture building. And so I think, these data were telling us that the trust is high with the direct supervisor. Well, probably more of that happens, and not that high with campus leadership, however that would be described by somebody. But it suggests that, to your point about culture and trust, it suggests that some of the symptoms that we're experiencing could be remedied by greater attention maybe to trust and culture, particularly at senior levels of the institution. And those don't require a lot of money. They require time, to your point, Julie. So really great points.
And I don't think they have to be really long interactions. I mean, Molly's point, 30-minute mentoring sessions, maybe there's longer pieces. I think this whole, Julie, I believe you started this conversation of people are feeling underappreciated and overworked. Some of it is just saying, it could be 2 minutes to say, thank you for doing that.
Yeah. How about
right?
that?
I think
thank you.
A thank you, right? And sometimes I think we get in this space of like, well, no one's thanking me. Why should I thank other people? Or maybe there's all this spin, when in reality, it's like, just pause. Mm-hmm. Say thank you. Appreciate the people. Have your words match your actions. I think there's just these little things that make a big impact.
And it might seem to some listeners like we're overly critical, but I think all four of us are, I like to say, bullish on higher ed. There's some real challenges, but I mean, totally committed, right? That's why we have these roles that are, in our cases, adjacent but immersed in higher ed. And, the book Good to Great talks about dealing with the brutal facts. And I feel like until we start talking about what's really going on and what the obligation and opportunity for leadership is and what employees are really telling us, verbally, but also when they leave, I mean, until we really wrestle with those things, we're not going to be able to help in the way that we think is possible, it seems to me. That may be a little highfalutin, but I feel like that it comes from a place of commitment to higher ed, but also we need to get real about what's not working in higher ed.
Well, I think it goes back to Loren, what you said, and Kelsey, what you just said about even just the thank you. But we talk a lot about one of my favorite Brene Brown sayings, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And so when people get really clear feedback, and feedback is not just, oh, you have something you need to work on, but feedback is, this is what you did really well. This is what I'm really liking about what you're contributing. And this is where maybe you have some opportunities. I think, Loren, to your point, people then know where to go, right? They know where to invest their time. They know where to do that. So the thank you, I agree. The thank you is important, but the clarity around what's working, because if all you ever hear is, you're doing a great job, keep it up. At some point, you're going to be like, what am I doing a great job at?
Like,
what am I
which part?
keeping up? Yeah. Like, what am I keeping up?
Part?
Like, what do you like? What's working? And then also people who are from kind of mid-level, like just above mid-level performers to high performers, they want feedback. They want to be told, how can I get better? How can I improve? Where do you see my opportunities? They are craving it. And so I think, Loren, when you look at why people might leave, sometimes it's just because they're not getting that opportunity. They're not hearing, and they're like, I'm kind of bored with just status quo. I don't want to just hum along here. I want to be challenged. I want to grow. I want to step into my power and my opportunity. And so that clarity around feedback and that clarity around direction, I think, is so critical to maintaining great talent and keeping them engaged.
I think that's the biggest thing. That's the biggest challenge we have or opportunity, right? Is teaching people even how to do that. So I think folks don't give feedback because they don't know. Either some people think like, okay, you're doing your a good job, so I don't have to tell you every single time. And or they don't know how to couple it with how to make them better, right? Because they think that somebody's going to be upset or whatnot. It is a hard situation to learn, but that would be a great addition to higher ed programs, things that you can like actually skill-based supervision to manage organizations.
What actually teach people how to be leaders? Julie, you're talking crazy, doc. I couldn't agree more. So one last question for both of you. I'm interested in on this kind of train of thought. What's something that you're working on for your personal development in this space? It's easy to kind of say what we think everyone else needs to work on. So is there something that you're focusing on for yourself?
Wait, you didn't invite us to this because we already knew?
I mean, I think we're all, I told my coach the other day, I was like, just when I thought I had that figured out, it's clear I don't.
Well, I guess I can go first because like sometime when I left higher education, like it just is, I've been trying to figure out, and this might be helpful for folks who are working in higher ed kind of adjacent roles as well. Like I still consider myself working in higher education because I kind of still feel a value, but for me that had to be there, right? Like I had to find the connection to how we were supporting higher education at a bigger level, or else I wasn't going to be able to do it. So I think for me, what I'm trying to do now is continue to make those connections and figure out like how I can contribute, like just in thought leadership to be like, what am I seeing? So this conversation has really helped me to see like, what am I actually seeing and what am I doing with it? Am I just writing a note on my computer so I can like post the next job? Or am I actually going to use some of the information in aggregate to support what's really happening on the campus? And I think that that's the struggle I have sometimes in order to figure out how to do it, because I always had an avenue, right? I was on a campus, I had a staff, or I was on a campus, I was in a division. And so like finding, I think the audience, I think has been difficult for me to figure out where does that go. But those are the kinds of things that I'm working on now and trying to think about how to scale that so that what I'm learning is helpful to others and it doesn't just stay in my office here in Seguin, Texas. That's not helpful.
I love it. How about you, Molly?
I think for me, I love to read. I love to learn, right? And so I'm always trying to carve out and create space for that. But the thing I wasn't creating space for was practice. And this idea of like continuing to say that really people who are really great at things practice. And when you think about the greatest athletes and you think about the greatest coaches and you think about the greatest leaders, like they're practicing. And so for me, it's this idea of what do I need to practice? And so do I need to practice giving feedback more frequently? Let me practice it because the only way I'm going to get really good at it is if I practice. And I think that so often we can get caught in the routine of our jobs that we forget that there's still opportunity to learn and there's still opportunity to practice. And so I'm really trying to lean into that idea of practice lately.
Well, to you both, thank you for letting us, maybe just me, practice podcasting with the two of you. You're just really so insightful, and you've helped us remember that data tell us things and skills tell us things, but trust and culture are at the root of everything. And that's such a good reminder for leaders everywhere and campus administrators everywhere, the importance of belonging, not only for our students, but also for our staff and faculty colleagues. And that sometimes the only cost it takes to get better and create healthier work environments is time. Sometimes that's the only cost. So thank you so much for what you're doing in higher education and for people in higher education and for your time today. We're grateful.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Had fun.
All right, are we ready for some extra credit?
Yes, ready.
My favorite time of episodes. So this is all about recruitment and retention, right? And it makes me think a little bit about recruitment stories. We've both been recruited for new jobs or have changed jobs. Has there been any lies or perceived lies?
Lies you've been told to take a job.
Lies you've been told. Or have you told any yourself?
Or have you told yourself lies to take the job?
Yes, I think all of these could be true.
Do an episode on lies.
Unintentional lying. Might call it stretching the truth.
I don't know if this is a lie, but I remember when I lived, let me preface it by saying, great people, great job, great place. But I remember when I was living in Connecticut, I was interviewing for a job in Missouri. And it was in Connecticut at the time. It's like late March, early April, a little cold and rainy. I flew into Missouri and it was beautiful. The birds were singing and the flowers were, the temperature was about 70. It was just gorgeous. Took the job up by myself. And then my wife and I flew there to look for a house in June. And we flew into St. Louis and we landed and this wall of humidity hit us in the face. And then we got this little like Geo Metro or something, this little rental car that we could afford to drive. And it was one of those cars where when you let off the accelerator, the air conditioning goes down. And then when you accelerate, then the air conditioning gets better, one of those. And she looked at me, she's like, where did we move? So that was I don't know that they lied to me, but they certainly didn't tell me when I came back in June that it was going to be really hot and humid.
Yeah, swampy.
How about your lies? or almost truths?
Almost truths. I don't know. I had a different story to tell, but you talking about the small car when we flew into Charlottesville. So Charlottesville, Virginia has an airport. There's 5 gates. They use 3 of them. That's the size of the airport. And we fly in for the interview and we rented a car. And I don't know if it's the way car rentals were, but it was like a Sonic the Hedgehog car. It was so small. Brian and I get in the car.
Or one of those Flintstones, put your feet through the floor to make
totally felt like that. And we get in the car and we drive to the hotel and it's pitch black. And what no one tells you in Central Virginia is there's no lights. There's no street lights. It's black. So you're driving down the road and you don't know if the road's going to end, if it's going to curve, if you're on a mountain.
Use your iPhone light out the window.
Yeah. He looked at me and was like, where are we?
Yeah.
It's going to be great, honey. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, we've got a few of those. And after we landed in this wonderful town, a week later, we had a door-to-door catfish salesman. You ever had one of those?
No.
So it took a little bit for her to fall in love with the whole thing after I accepted without her seeing it. So
he wasn't like the Schwan man selling catfish?
This was an unexpected knock at the door. We had not placed an order. And the bag was dripping, and he said, "Do you want to buy some catfish?"
So it was really catfish.
It was really catfish, and it was dripping. And my wife, who's much nicer than me, rather than insulting him, said, "I don't know how to prepare it." To which he said, "I'd be happy to show you." And that was my cue to say no and close the door. So
it's amazing.
It's a true story.
Okay. Until next time.
See ya.
Campus Confidential is presented by Compass Group. Produced by Corey Inscoe, with your hosts Kelsey Harmon Finn and Loren Rullman.